The title I've got here is Rewilding, Can We Add Domestic Livestock to the Blend? And I think Lynn would say yes, and so I might as well say that's it. And let's go to question time. I'm doing this on behalf of myself, Adrian Manning from Australian National University, and Leisha Navarro and Juliette Rouet Leduc and Javier Perez Barberia. So they're all co-authors. There's a couple of papers this talk is based on, and I'll give those references at the end. But firstly, I thought I would just go to the idea of what we think about wilderness, and because that is central to the idea of rewilding. So here I have some photographs, which are the ones that we pick up when we think about ideas of wilderness. Generally, it's a place where humans have not trod. So like the areas of northern Siberia, the mountains and landscapes of northern Canada, into the outback of Australia around Uluru, and the large plains of Africa where we see wildebeest, zebra, Thompson's gazelles roaming. So these are our images of wilderness, and generally those images of wilderness do not include people. And also people have had massive impacts on the ecosystems of the planet, be it through plastic pollution, overgrazing and erosion of landscapes, deforestation. It is thought that only about 3% of the planet is now untouched by human activities, and human activities have had demonstrable impacts on ecosystems for at least the past 120,000 years. So humans are often seen as coming into landscapes and creating significant issues around impacts on ecosystems and long-term effects on ecosystem degradation. And so there is this idea of that people have not just, it's not just a recent thing. So this great image on the left-hand side is an image of the now extinct species that there were in northern Australia around the Riversley region, including giant wombats, giant kangaroos, giant lizards, and giant birds, giant emus. So, and these species were ones that grazed, browsed, predated, and these are now extinct, and there is a coincidence between the arrival of humans in these landscapes and the extinction of many of these species, not just in Australia, but also in North America, in Eastern and Northern Asia. And so humans, again, are seen as being destructive to the wildlife that lives in these systems. Because of this, there's now this emerging advocacy for the idea of rewilding, or bringing back the wild. And so here I have several things just brought out of the news in the past week or so. So a couple from the UK about rewilding, one from the oceans, another one from India, and another one from Australia. So you can see across the planet there are conversations going on around rewilding. And as Lynn was saying in her talk, the idea of wilderness and wild landscapes has been around for a long time. So in the USA, wilderness was seen as areas which were untrammeled by humans. So in 1964, the US Wilderness Act says that wilderness is an area of land untrammeled by man, where man is a visitor who does not remain. And a wilderness is an area governed by natural processes without intrusive or extractive human activity, and that's from Wild Europe Initiative. So in effect, the idea is that humans remove themselves from wild landscapes, and that natural process is allowed to return and nature is able to take its own course. And so there are a range of different types of rewilding. So it was really Sule and Noss in 1998 that brought back the idea of rewilding. And they were particularly interested in cores, corridors, and carnivores. So core areas of rewilding landscapes, corridors between these, and carnivores as being an important reintroduction into these wildscapes. There came there was also the idea from Donlan et al. In 2005 around Pleistocene rewilding. And this was the idea of bringing back wild landscapes to the time in the Pleistocene before it was thought that human had major impacts. And because a number of the species have gone extinct, so here we see things like the saber-toothed tiger, saber-toothed lion, that were predators in these systems. There was the idea of bringing, say, into North America lions to fulfill the role that these extinct predators had. There's passive rewilding, and in part that's due to land abandonment, and that's the conversation I had with Lynn in the question time, and translocation rewilding. So that's bringing species into landscapes in order to fulfill a range of different functions. Myself and others have put it into this diagram. So we move from urban intensive use areas, which are highly human modified, into areas that are increasing within their naturalness and wilderness. So we call it rewilding max, where in effect there are areas that have predators and where limited human intervention occurs, and rewilding light, which is areas where there is some human intervention, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And so we would call those sort of semi-natural or semi-wild situations, but they're still primarily dominated by ecological processes that are found in rewilded landscapes. It's just that they are delivered in effect by people. And as I said, rewilding is becoming a major conversation now in the public sphere and in the academic sphere. So we're talking about, until about 2013, 15, 20 to 25 papers a year coming out with rewilding in their title or abstract, and now we're talking about over 100 papers coming out per year, and that's only increasing exponentially in a viral kind of way. And so we have projects like Rewilding Europe, whose objectives are to create wilder nature, bring back wildlife into landscapes, look at ways in which we can generate nature-based economies. That includes things like ecotourism, increase interest in wild landscapes, and expand the area of wild landscapes in Europe. And in part, that's a response to the depopulation of the rural areas. We also have in the UK, and in the UK, because it's just left the European Union, there's now talk about how do we maintain agricultural activity in landscapes, and in part that then comes to some of the conversations we're having around rewilding light. And so we have a range of different projects here that are of various different types that are rewilding landscapes in Europe, in the UK. So now I'll go on to speak about 4 specific case studies that we use in the paper that's in Frontiers. So the first one is Norwegian reindeer herding. So this is in effect a rewilding light landscape where Sami herders herd reindeer and take from them products, but those reindeer are able to operate in a semi-domesticated way, so interacting with forests, open areas, creating the landscapes that we know from Northern Europe. So that's Sweden, Norway, Finland, and into northern Russia. And so the Rewilding Sweden project seeks to create an economy based on the unique sociocultural ecosystem that includes the Sami culture, wildlife, and free-flowing rivers. So the Sami, as a First Nations people in that area, are able to retain an income, are able to utilize reindeer, and reindeer are able to create those landscapes. So that's a rewilding light situation where we have a semi-domestic animal operating in that system. But as I said before, for many ecosystems, the herbivores that are natural to those systems are now extinct because of often human activity. And so we don't have those natural grazers like the reindeer in Northern Europe to be able to graze those systems. So in the Coa Valley in Portugal, there are projects that have been set up in order to, through the Rewilding Europe, in order to be able to graze these landscapes and reduce the fuel load that would happen if we had a totally rewilded system. And so they use horses and ancient breeds of cattle. And in the Fai Brava Nature Reserve, which is about 850 hectares, these animals are grazed, and the local farmers are able to take their livestock into this system in a managed way and manage the system in order to be able to retain and improve the wild nature of the landscape, but at the same time ensure that the fuel load is managed. So here we're using domestic animals to manage the fuel load at the same time as allowing the landscape to become more wild, and using domestic animals as ways of reintroducing ecological process of herbivory. Clearly, because of the small nature of these farms, of these reserves, and the fact that they're within a farming landscape, predators are not really part of the system, and so humans in effect act as predators by removing animals from these landscapes. Another example that we have used is in the Knepp Castle, or Knepp Estate in the UK, which is very close to London. Here, it's about 1,400 hectares in size, and it was a farmed landscape. The people were unable to maintain a living off this farmed landscape, and so they set it to become a rewilding or a wilding landscape, where they used ancient breeds of cattle, horses, pigs, and they have native or deer that are able to graze in this system. And they also take off meat products, and they have ecotourism. So again, herbivory is part of this landscape through the domestic animals. And at the same time, the people who own the land are able to maintain a living. So again, here, this is a landscape that is heading towards one which is dominated by wild ecological processes through particularly herbivory, at the same time as increasing the biodiversity value. So the range of species here that are now found only in this landscape, because all the rest of the surrounding area is still high intensity farming. Now, Lynn may know of this work that goes on in Europe around Vera's wood pasture model. So one of the ideas here is that the traditional landscapes of Europe were an open wood pasture with grazing lands and trees. The areas that we see that are now heavily forest dominated are actually because of the fact that humans extirpated many of the wild species of herbivores, the aurochs and the tarpans. So the aurochs are large cow-like animals, and tarpans are wild horses that graze these wood pasture systems. So Vera suggested that basically, in order to be able to return Europe to the pre-human impacts, so again, rewilding, we needed to reintroduce grazing into this system to have trees and also pastures. So one of the poster children of rewilding is the Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands. So that was set up in the 1970s. It actually is a reclaimed land. So it's a polder, and in this landscape, they were seeing that there was increases in trees and shrub density, and so they introduced a range of different species, including het cattle, which are purportedly very like the old aurochs. They introduced the deer and also horses, and they allowed these animals to free range. So they introduced originally, I think it was, if I remember rightly, about 32 het cattle, about 18 Konig horses, which are the wild horses, and 40 red deer, and the population grew to about 5,000 individuals in 6,000 hectares. And what happened then was that because there was no predation, these animals started to starve and die. And Vera was of the opinion that this was part of nature's cycle. The local or both national and international public opinion did not agree with that. And so there was huge public outcry at these animals dying so close to Amsterdam. There were people who were throwing bales of hay over the fence to feed the animals. And so eventually in 2018, there was a review, and it was decided to cull animals and also to remove animals from here and put them in other places. So in effect, by just having a herbivory with no predation, you ended up in a system which is probably very unnatural in terms of having massive rises and falls in the populations of herbivores. And this is a system which needs carnivory or predation. And that predation, in effect, is now instituted by human hand. So humans are acting as the top predators in this system. So this is a figure from the paper, and it just shows that we moved from a system which is highly managed under most of the natural intensive grazing management systems that we know, through ones where we look at rewilding light, which includes things like the case study that we saw of Nep Castle and the Fire Brava in Portugal, and the Sami reindeer herding, through to this hands-off rewilding, which we saw in Oostvaardersplassen and causes this massive problem in terms of herbivore die-off. We also look at the idea about how do we fit rewilding into an adaptive management framework. So the idea that we do not know everything that will happen in these systems, and in order to be able to achieve the outcomes that we are after, we need to look at ways in which we can learn from the actions that we put in place and then adapt our management to suit the changing circumstances. So we first need to obviously describe what the rewilding objectives are, for example, including trophic complexity and mitigation, the encroachment of shrubs in things like alpine grasslands. rewilding model implementation, and then monitoring, and then adapting the management. And sometimes we need to realize that stopping is an important part of any decision, that stopping doing things or stopping doing what you're doing is an important part of any management protocol. So what we also argue is that there are a range of different herbivores, domestic herbivores available, which have a range of different behaviors, functional processes, values to humans, that can replicate some of the grazing practice, grazing and browsing that wild species are able to affect. So we need to look at that suite of domestic herbivores and see how we can use them more effectively. So the conclusions then from the work that we've been doing recently, I got new kid, no, I think I did mean new kid, sorry. Rewilding is the new kid on the block. I thought I'd said kind. And there are philosophical debates over the purity of the idea. So the purists would say that no human intervention is necessary in order for nature to take its course, but we can see what happens in the wildfires that there were in Australia, in California, in Southern Europe. If we just let nature take its course, herbivory was part of these systems in the past. Often it is not there now because of the fact that the species that did the herbivory are extinct, often through human hands. And so we need to reintroduce herbivory. And if we reintroduce herbivory, we need to reintroduce predation as well. And sometimes that herbivory can be done by domestic animals, and sometimes the predation can be done by humans. And so I view this as a pragmatic approach towards rewilding, and I called it rewilding light. This allows herbivory process to be reinstated into these systems, creates opportunities outside protected areas. So I think that many farmers, and we'll probably see this in the UK in the next 10 years, will take on the idea of environmental management or rewilding light in order to be able to remain on the landscapes and gain income directly from the products that they sell, but also indirectly through the public service that they provide. And also there will be benefits to people as well as nature from the adoption of a rewilding light approach. So our argument there is that this is the future for much of the landscapes outside of protected areas, and even those that are in protected areas. And then the final slide here is just references to the couple of papers that we've produced this year. One is associated with this conference in Frontier Sustainable Food Systems, and the other one is in sustainability. The second one in sustainability goes more into the use of traditional domestic livestock to achieve rewilding outcomes. So thank you all very much for listening, and thanks, Tom.